that was kind of a defining moment in my career for me. I often go back to that moment when I'm doubting myself and, ask myself, like, why not me? I do deserve a seat at this table, and this might be something that could resonate with a lot of people.
Welcome to For the Long Run, the podcast exploring the why behind what keeps runners running long, strong, and motivated. I'm your host, Jonathan Levitt. Through personal and professional connections in the running world, I have the privilege of getting to know some amazing athletes. I've always been fascinated by the psychological aspect of running, and this podcast is aimed at exploring this and much more. I hope you enjoy. This episode is brought to you by Lyric to help enable everybody and every body to feel better every day. Lyric is a therapeutic massager and home wellness companion. It's designed for display so you won't forget to use it, and it looks beautiful on any coffee table. It even includes an accessory handle to find those hard-to-reach places so that you can massage your back by yourself. Grab yours today for $1.99 at national retailers like Target, Best Buy, Bed Bath & Beyond, or REI, or get free shipping online with the code FTLR at experiencelyric.com. This episode is brought to you by Gooder. Summer is here, and Gooder has the slickest shades around for only $25 and $35. They don't slip or bounce, and they stay on my face way better than more expensive sunglasses do. If you'd like to support me and the show, treat yourself to a pair or two or three of Gooders and head over to gooder.com and get 15% off your entire order with the code FTLR. That's 15% off at gooder.com, code FTLR. Your face will thank you. Welcome back. I have Emilia Benton joining me on the podcast today. Emilia, thanks so much for taking some time to chat.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. So the first question is always a tough one, so we'll dive right into it. Who is Emilia?
I am a freelance journalist, primarily covering running, health, and fitness. I'm also an avid runner, about to gear up to start training for my 11th marathon. I'm also a Houstonian, a Latina. I'm a wife to my husband, Omar, a twin to my sister, Carla, and a dog mom to my Boston Terrier rescue, Astra.
Very nice. A very succinct bio there. So 11 marathons is awesome and impressive. Why did you sign up for your first one?
I was in college when I first started thinking about eventually doing my first marathon. I've been a runner since I was in high school. And when I was in college, I kind of got clued into the pro scene a little bit. I went to college in New York, and so I followed the New York City Marathon when it was happening every year. And I remember following a little more closely the year that Paula Radcliffe won. I think it was 2007, the same year that she had a baby. And I remember thinking that was really inspiring, and maybe running the New York City Marathon one day would be a cool goal and challenge to work toward. So I looked into what it would take to be able to register to run the New York City Marathon. And I think a lot of people are more familiar with like the lottery system and the charity system. But if you're local to the New York City area, they have a program called the 9+1 program, where if you do 9 of the New York Roadrunners races and volunteer at one the year before you want to run the marathon, then you can get guaranteed entry. So I did that. I started doing that my senior year of college in my final semester. I ran my first half marathon that January with my twin sister. And then I didn't do any more races before I graduated from college that spring. And I did my remaining 8 races that summer and fall and winter from June through December of 2009, and then qualified to run the 2010 New York City Marathon. And so I guess that's the story right there, how I got to running my first marathon.
Very cool. Do you remember that day?
Yeah. Well, I trained mostly solo. The social running scene definitely wasn't what it is today in 2010. So that's what I remember most about it. I remember, I was fresh out of college, so my training was very bare bones. Like most of my running clothes were from like Old Navy and Target, and I didn't have a GPS watch. I had a $10 Timex watch that I got at Target, and I would plan most of my long runs like by mapping them out on Map My Run. So I would mostly run around my neighborhood in Astoria, Queens, and for my long runs across the Queensboro Bridge and into Central Park. And for my really long runs, like the 20 milers, the New York Road Runners had a few organized runs in Central Park. I think they did 2 that were just supported training runs, and then 1 that was an 18-mile run that was actually a race. And I did all of those. So I felt like that prepared me pretty well for the race. And then when I got to the race, I felt pretty well prepared for it, but I feel like I got kind of a little too caught up in the excitement of it and went out way too fast. And I ran the first half of the marathon in 1:52, which would have been about a 12-minute PR for me at the time. So you can guess how the second half panned out. I definitely died in the second half, but I don't remember ever like feeling bad during the race. I remember having fun the whole time, even though I definitely slowed down a lot in the second half. I remember just feeling really enthused and happy the whole time. And as soon as I finished, I couldn't wait to do my next one. And I finished in 4:09, which didn't really mean a lot to me at the time, but I like loosely set this goal for myself to finish around 4:30. So finishing in 4:09, it felt pretty solid. But in hindsight, I can't help but think like if I had been a little bit smarter about my pacing strategy, I probably could have broken 4 hours in that first marathon. But live and learn, right?
Yes. So that was about 10 years ago.
Yep.
Where you went through the experience of training for your first, you did the 9 races, you volunteered. What did it feel like to be a part of that club, like the marathon club? Like you've done it.
Yeah, it felt awesome. I mean, it definitely felt like bucket list goal checked, but I knew it wouldn't be my last one. I couldn't wait to do my next one. And I definitely felt like I wanted to, kind of unlock whatever my potential could be. And even though I knew I was still pretty far away from the school, I knew after that first one that I wanted to probably try to qualify for the Boston Marathon one day. And that's a goal that I'm still working toward.
Why? What is it about Boston?
I don't know. I guess it just feels like a good benchmark for a lot of marathoners to kind of unlock what your potential can be. I feel like it's a good benchmark and good challenge for a lot of runners to work toward. And I've chipped away at that goal over the years. My PR now is 3:45, so not that far away, but still far enough away that it feels like a good challenge. So I'm excited to work toward that again this fall.
What's the time that you need? Is it 3:30?
I'm 34 now, so I would be 35 whenever I would run Boston if it's in the next few years. So I would need a 3:35 or probably under 3:30 to actually come under whatever the cutoff time would be.
What do you think it'll take to get there?
Well, I know this year, because of what happened with COVID and there being, I guess, twice the applicants for about half the normal field, I think this year it was about a 7-minute cutoff. So I hope it's not that much when I need to do it because.
Oh, I meant, what do you think it'll be to take 15 minutes off of your PR? What's that process like? How do you break that part down?
Well, I ran my last PR in January 2019. And I was actually training to try to qualify at the January 2020 Houston Marathon. And I felt like my training leading up to it definitely indicated that I was heading in that direction. I broke 140 in the half marathon for the first time the fall leading up to it. And then I ran a couple of tune-up races, a 25K and a 30K, practicing marathon goal pace and practicing a pacing strategy. And it indicated that I was in shape for that. And then I got injured about a month before the race. I got a really ill-timed bout of tendonitis and I ended up missing the race. And, this was a few months before the pandemic hit. So the last year has been a little unpredictable. I felt like I've kind of been clawing my way back to that kind of fitness. But I think with some work this summer and this fall, I think I could get close enough to get close to that goal. I know at first glance, 15 minutes sounds like a lot, but I'll be 3 years removed from my last marathon. I think that's a good amount of time to have, built up a good amount of progress to get back there again.
I agree. I went from a 3:20 to a 2:59 with a 2-year gap, and I want to do something similar again this fall. Maybe not a 20-minute PR, but a 10-minute PR with the 2-year gap. And I think these long breaks, when you have the sustained progress or sustained running in between, even if there is a little bit of a layoff, as you mentioned, I think you can really surprise yourself with what happens next. And I went into that marathon in 2019 not having run one since Boston 2017, where I didn't even break 4. And so I went from a 4:01 to a 2:59. I mean, I had a 3:20 from 2016, but yeah, it's really cool what can happen in the year or 2 years in terms of mental training and mental toughness and your ability to just like hold the pace that used to seem totally unreasonable.
Yeah, and it does seem like mentally, it does seem like it'll be challenging to get back into that racing mindset again. But at the same time, I think being so far removed from my last marathon and it being so long since I got to run another marathon, I think I'm gonna appreciate that moment even more.
For sure. So you mentioned when you were training for the New York City Marathon, the first time around, you did most of your runs solo. Talking about the Houston running community and the community that you're a part of.
Yeah, so I moved back to Houston in 2011. And although I was born here and I grew up here, we moved to Oregon when I was in high school and then I went to college in New York. And so when I moved back to Houston, I hadn't spent a lot of time here in a while. And I certainly hadn't spent much time running here. So I knew I wanted to find a running club just to get familiar with good running routes around the city. So that was my first time running with other people, which I never really did in New York. And I've really never looked back. During the week, I still run mostly solo during the week just because I tend to run later than most people in Houston, which is not really that late. I run at like 6:30 or 7 a.m. most mornings, but most people with 9 to 5 jobs tend to run earlier in the day. But for long runs, it definitely makes a huge difference to have training partners to do those really long runs with, especially with the brutally hot and humid summers that we get here in Houston. So I've been a member of the Houston Harriers Running Club for a couple of years now. It's a great group of people.
Talk to me about that heat that you mentioned. What is it like? I mean, you're wearing a sweatshirt now, so I can't imagine it's hot inside. But talk to me about what it's like training through whatever it is.
Yeah, I'm wearing a hoodie right now because I'm indoors. That's definitely a hashtag Houston problem. I'm perpetually cold in the AC, but as soon as we get off this call, I'm gonna, strip down to my tank top and shorts to take my dog out on his walk, which is common here in Houston. And so with the heat and humidity here, I feel like I never truly acclimate to it. I feel like all summer it's a slog to get out there, and in the summers I just have to accept that I'm going to slow down a little bit and accept that even in my speed workouts, it's going to be a little slower and it's going to have to be more effort based. But once fall hits, and if you're training for a fall race, and if you get ideal cooler weather, you definitely feel a boost. And so, as brutal as it can be in the summer, the training in the hot and humid summers definitely builds character and makes you stronger.
Totally. So today is July 15th. This episode will probably be out in 2 weeks at the end of July. And so I feel like that's a useful reminder to everyone tuning in July and August that it might suck now to be running in a furnace, but fast forward a few weeks and when the heat and humidity breaks for the first time, those runs can be magical.
Yeah, I do a half marathon here in Houston in October, just about every year. It's the last weekend of October. And usually we're lucky that that's one of the first weekends in the fall where we get ideal, like about 50-degree weather. And if you're used to training in the hot and humid summer, you're going to fly at that race.
For sure. So we've talked a bit about your running, and you do quite a lot of writing about other people's running. So talk to me about what you do professionally.
Yeah, so I'm a freelance writer and editor. I primarily cover running, health, and fitness. I write for a lot of running and fitness publications like Runner's World, Women's Running, Self, Shape, Women's Health, etc. Yeah, I've been freelance for a little over 4 years now, and I love it. I say often that this is the dream job I never knew I wanted because I kind of fell into freelance life after I got laid off from my last full time job. And although running, health, and fitness are definitely, I feel like they're my go to, my niche areas, it's not all I write about. And I think it can be, for anyone who might be interested in this career or interested in pursuing it, it's definitely worthwhile to consider other interests that you might have because there's definitely sometimes slower periods in certain areas. So it's good to kind of expand your horizons and explore other interests you have. So I don't just write about running and fitness. I also do a little bit of like a lot of health, some like education stuff, some personal finance and real estate stuff. So a little of everything. And it's all really fun.
Cool. And what's your educational background?
I studied journalism. I went to Hofstra University in New York. So I did know for a long time that I wanted to pursue this career.
What was it about journalism?
I've always loved reading, especially like reading newspapers and magazines and following the news. And it's actually kind of a funny story. When I was in high school, I realized how much I loved reading magazines. And I subscribed to a lot of magazines, like a lot of teen magazines. And I remember one of my favorite ones, Cosmo Girl. The editor used to write in her like monthly editor's note, feel free to email me about anything, anytime. So I did that one and I emailed her about like asking some advice, like what would it take to pursue this career. And she actually wrote me back.
How old were you?
I was 14. I was a freshman in high school. And this was Atusa Rubenstein, the then editor of Cosmo Girl. And she wrote me back. And one of the biggest pieces of advice that she gave me was to consider attending college in the New York City area, because then you could put yourself in a good place to be available for in-person interviews for internships and job interviews at some of these companies, because New York is where a lot of these publishing companies are based. So that's what I ended up doing. When I was in high school, I visited a few colleges in that area and eventually settled on Hofstra University. And that's where I went and never looked back.
What was the process or experience like going from Texas to New York?
Actually, when I was 13 or 14, we moved to Oregon. So that's where I went to high school. Yeah. So that's where
also a very different place.
Yes, for sure. And even going from Houston to Oregon was a huge culture shock, because Houston is one of the most diverse cities in the country, and moving to rural Oregon was polar opposite of that. So that also played into my decision to attend college in New York. I knew I wanted to go to a more culturally diverse area, and New York was the perfect place for that. I definitely felt more at home in a big city like New York after being in Oregon for 4 years.
Was it a family move to Oregon?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My mom passed away when I was 11. And so a couple years after that, my dad just decided he was ready for a change, and he always wanted to live in the Pacific Northwest. So that's where we went.
Got it. What town were you in?
We were in Newport, which is about, it's Central Oregon coast. So if you're going to visit, you usually have to fly into Portland, and then it's about a 3-hour drive to Newport.
Got it.
Yeah.
So Texas, Oregon, New York. What was the Oregon to New York journey like for you?
I mean, all throughout high school, I felt like I couldn't wait to get out of there and get ready to pursue the career goals that I had for myself for a long time. I guess I never really looked back. I lived New York, and I still visited Oregon quite a bit while my dad lived there. He's back in Houston now, but it's pretty expensive to fly back there. So I probably wouldn't have made very many visits back there if my dad wasn't still there.
Got it.
Yeah.
So jumping back to journalism, talk to me about the process of, so you were let go from your job.
Mm-hmm.
What happened next?
Yeah. So I worked at the Houston Chronicle here in Houston for about 3 years, and I loved it. But honestly, I wasn't making enough money there. So I decided I needed to, pursue my next career opportunity after about 3 years there. And I moved on to another job in the healthcare industry. I was working at a cancer research hospital as a scientific editor on the informed consent documents that patients would have to digest and sign before signing on to participate in clinical trials. So I did that for about a year and then got laid off from that job. And actually, about a month before I got laid off from that job, I had actually been thinking about a story idea that I wanted to pitch to Runner's World. Although I had done some freelance work before that, I had never had to send a cold pitch to anyone. The couple of freelance jobs that I had were through connections. So I was friends with Allie Feller of the Allie on the Run Show podcast, and she had been freelancing for a while at that point for a bunch of different places. I don't think she had launched her podcast at that point. I think she was still pretty ingrained in the freelance world. So I emailed her for some advice about how to send that first pitch, and to ask her if she possibly had a contact at Runner's World that I could reach out to. And being as awesome as she is, she got back to me and she gave me lots of really great advice and shared a contact for that. And I ended up sending off that pitch, and it got accepted. And the story that I wrote ended up being, a lot more well received than I expected it to. And the rest is kind of history from there.
What was the story?
It was a personal essay about, leading up to that point, I had kind of gone through a few years where I'd kind of gotten a little obsessive in my running and my training. I'd kind of dug myself into a hole where I'd kind of run myself into the ground and kind of overtrain myself a bit, kind of getting obsessive about pursuing my goals. And because I was, taking myself a little too seriously and being too hard on myself, it was kind of self-sabotage, and I was not running PRs. I don't think I'd run PRs in any distances in about 3 years at that point. And it was once, I'd learned to chill out a little bit and, take a break when I needed to, not force myself to run on vacation, for example. Once I chilled out a little bit, that was when I finally started seeing the PRs that I'd been chasing for years. And so the title of that story was I Learned to Chill Out During Marathon Training. Here's what happened. Runner's World at the time was doing a lot of stories like that, like I did such and such thing and here's what happened. And when I pitched that story and when I published it, like I wasn't sure if I was going to promote it that much. I wasn't sure if people would really care that much. It felt kind of self-indulgent, to be talking about my training and experience so much. But I was surprised at the response that I got, not just from people that I knew within my local community here, but like, all over the country when Runners World shared it on their social media channels. And when the editor I worked on told me, please keep pitching us if you have other ideas, that kind of like sparked a light bulb in me, like, oh, maybe this is something that I could pursue. And so I talked to Allie a little bit more after that, like about making more connections and sending out more pitches. And it definitely wasn't like overnight success after that story. I definitely spent about a year and a half sending tons of pitches and building relationships and often not ever getting any responses to what I wrote about or to pitches that I was sending out there. But that's definitely part of the process. If anyone is interested in pursuing a career as a freelance writer, I would definitely emphasize that it's definitely possible to have a full-time career as a freelance writer, but it's definitely going to take a lot of persistence and hustle in the beginning.
Very cool. What did it feel like when Runner's World said, basically, this was successful, please keep in touch?
Yeah, it was surprising, and it felt great to know that, this experience, even though it might have, it didn't feel great and positive, like in the moment as I was going through it and experiencing that, it felt good to know that my experience might have helped some people.
Thanks again to Lyric for sponsoring this episode. Lyric's rhythm therapy is designed to help everybody and every body relax and temporarily relieve pain. As the miles have continued to grow this marathon season, using Lyric has been a great way to effortlessly help with some good passive recovery in between sessions. Get yours today for $1.99 at national retailers like Target, Best Buy, Bed Bath & Beyond, or REI, or get free shipping online right to your door with the code FTLR at experiencellyric.com. Thanks again to Gooder for supporting this episode. I have a few different styles of shades, and I've been loving them on runs or while at the pool. At $25 a pop, you can leave a pair in your car so that you'll never be without some shades. You can feel good about your purchase too, as 1% of Gooder's annual gross sales, not profits, go directly to environmental nonprofits working towards making our world a better place. If you'd like to support me in the show, treat yourself to a pair or two or three of Gooders and head over to gooder.com and get 15% off your entire order. That's 15% off at GOODR.com with the code FTLR. Your face will thank you. And now back to our conversation. So you called it self-indulgent, but it resonated quite a lot. It has been really interesting to watch social media evolve over the last couple of years to go from like a complete highlight reel and people only ever talking about their victories to people talking about feeling stuck and feeling unmotivated and injury and burnout. What year was this pitch, or what year was this essay?
It was 2017.
Why do you think it resonated so much? Why do you think it was successful?
I've heard a lot of people say that it's kind of a pet peeve when they see like running bloggers or influencers or whatever only talk about the positive and never share the bad things, like the lows in their training. And, I get both sides of it. I mean, people don't want to talk about the lows because it's not, it's not fun to talk about the negatives and the things that aren't going well. But I think it would be good for more people to consider that, because training isn't always rainbows and butterflies, and more people than you realize can probably relate to the bad things as much as the good things.
Totally. So I did a podcast with Tori Gerlach a couple of weeks ago, and Tori's a track athlete and didn't have the showing at the Olympic trials that she wanted. And at the time of our podcast, she hadn't posted anything on social media. And we got to talking about her use of social media. And she was like, yeah, I've got this post with non-running clothes and a caption written. And I just like can't hit send on it because I don't have anything good to say. And I was like, send it, see what happens. And she sent it, which I love to say now that I live in Colorado. So she sent it and the response was incredible. It was like, oh my God, I love you. This is great. I'm with you. I'm, supporting you. Like all this stuff that it's so wild that we are such critics of ourselves, and we always forget that at the end of the day, like, it's just running. Like, nobody cares, and
Mhm.
they care way more about the experience and the meaning, and we all care about the meaning we attach to whatever it is that you're achieving, right? Like, if you run a 329 or a 331, you're still the same person. You've
Mhm.
still done something you've never done before. Maybe you didn't qualify for Boston. I felt the same way with my 4 failed attempts at BQing that it took me to experience before I ran that 259. And I think, I don't want to promise, but I think that if I ran a 301 on that day, I would have been almost as stoked as if I ran 259 or 249. Actually, I would have been on another planet if I ran
Yeah.
249. But the point is, like, as you talked about, it's the process of getting better. And you haven't done a marathon in 2 years or 3 years, and you're excited to see what happens versus like showing up, I must run a 330. And I think that's so empowering and so freeing. And I talk about this like literally every time somebody brings it up, because it's what I would have wanted and needed to hear when I was stuck in that same rut. And like you, I went years without PRing, and I went years without seeing measurable progress from races. My training was great, but I was so hard on myself and I attached so much meaning to the outcome that maybe it was self-sabotage too. Like, I would go out at 305 pace and then run a 320 or a 327.
Mhm.
And to run a 327 or a 401 when you go out at a 3-hour pace is, you have to do something like really, really wrong. And so it's a really long-winded way to say, I really appreciate the way that you told that story. And I'm happy to hear that even in 2017, 2018, like, that type of story resonated. I would only imagine what would happen if you published the same article again in 2021 in this new era of like, it's okay to not be okay. I think the resounding positive response you heard then would be 10 times now what it was then.
Yeah.
What inspired you to hit send on that one?
I guess, I mean, like I said, I first thought of that idea when I was still at my last full time job. And, after I had asked Ali Feller for some advice on sending that pitch, I didn't feel too confident in myself at the time while I was still at that job. And I kind of sat on it for a while. I was still thinking, like, maybe people aren't going to be interested in this. And maybe Runners World won't even be interested in it either. Like, maybe they're just going to pass on it. And it was only after I got laid off that I said, like, I might as well send it. Like, what do I have to lose? If they say no, they say no. And that was kind of a defining moment in my career for me. I often go back to that moment when I'm doubting myself and, ask myself, like, why not me? I do deserve a seat at this table, and this might be something that could resonate with a lot of people.
Is imposter syndrome something that you experience?
For sure. It took a long time for me to kind of understand these feelings and kind of reconcile these feelings of imposter syndrome. But one of the biggest things when I left New York, and, I thought when I was leaving New York that I was closing the door on a career in journalism because the industry is so ingrained in that area. And I didn't really realize at the time, but a big aspect of why after I graduated from college and I felt like I might not really belong in this space is because in the internships and the in-house freelance positions that I held, like, there's not a lot of diversity there. And as a woman of color, there wasn't really much representation in like full-time staffs on a lot of magazines. And that matters. I think now it's a lot of publications and companies are becoming more aware of how important it is to not just have representation and diversity in the subjects they're covering, but also in the people they have on staff and the freelancers that are writing for them. And that's definitely been a big part of why I had some of these feelings of imposter syndrome in the past, and why sometimes I still deal with them. But I've gotten a little bit better at reminding myself that, I do have a lot of the experience and expertise, and I do deserve a seat at this table.
What does it mean to you to be a role model in that space, that somebody sees you, sees your name, sees your face, and maybe they feel like they belong too?
I don't know if I'd consider myself a role model. That's
I mean, your name is in Runner's World. Your name is in
Yeah.
women's running, all this stuff.
Yeah, but I don't feel like a lot of people know me in the same way that they know a lot of the other bigger names out there, and I think that does have a lot to do with it. Like something that I've talked about in other interviews and podcasts kind of recently is that, like, sometimes I've seen like on Twitter, for example, like I often see and in newsletters I see articles shared where the author or the sharer will tag the person by name and say, this is a great article by so and so, if it's a pretty well known writer in the space. And it's probably not intentional on their part, but it's more common that they'll recognize that person by name if it is, a more well known white writer in the space. And often writers and creators of color don't get that kind of credit. And I think that's worth pointing out because it's not just about, like, it's not just me harping on the fact that I don't have as big a following as some of these people, but for people like me, it could make or break, if the right person sees that we get credited for that, it could make or break if we get a certain opportunity.
Yeah, that makes sense. I had a conversation with an athlete named Rajpal Panu. He's a first generation Indian living in Denver, formerly San Francisco. And we were talking about something similar where he brought up the fact that he's often the only person that looks like himself on start lines. And he's like, you don't need to know who I am. You just need to know that I exist and that I'm there and that somebody watching can see themselves in me and know that they could do it too. So I might push back on your statement of, well, I'm not a big name. I don't think that matters. I think that the fact that you're there at the table, as you said, you have a seat at the table, and that piece, like, who knows who's seeing that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I can see that. That does make sense for people who might be watching on the outside. But I guess, like, in the sense of me trying to grow my career, I think it could make a difference in getting that next
For
opportunity.
sure. Yeah. For sure. I mean, there's so much that has been, I don't want to say uncovered, but people have become, I'm guilty of this just as much as anybody else. Like the things that I became aware of in 2020 and 2021, like I said this on the podcast, I looked at my guest list and I'm pretty sure I didn't have a person of color on as a guest until Alphine, which was episode 58. And that's embarrassing. Like there are so many athletes that, or writers or people in the industry or whatever, but it's like, you don't, like we had blinders on, I guess, like just totally unaware. Like it wasn't intentional, but it happens. So like just having this conversation makes me think of like, how am I doing and perpetuating what you're saying? And, the fact that you walk into an office or a magazine and that's what you see, like that's wrong. And so anyone, I think with a platform or with influence or a writer or making decisions of athletes to sponsor, like we all have a responsibility to like at least think about it and change and continue that change.
Yeah.
So switching gears a little bit or a bit, where do you come up with the pitches? So for somebody who's listening and they're like, I love writing. I'm a writer. I think I want to pitch Runner's World or Women's Running or whatever. Like, where does that come from? And what does the process look like?
Yeah, I'm lucky that at this point in my career, I don't have to do a lot of pitching. A lot of the stories that I work on now are assignments that the editors come to me directly with what they want me to write about. So these days, if I do pitch something, it's usually something that I'm actually super interested in and something that I'm passionate about and really want to write about. So I guess it comes from a place of, just being super interested in whatever it is. And maybe it's a topic or a person that you haven't really seen covered much. I guess one recent example that I can think of is after the marathon project took place last December, I pitched a profile to Runner's World on Andrea Limon, one of the marathoners from Mexico, who I think she placed sixth in that race. And, she ran well under the Olympic qualifying standard in the marathon. So she qualified to be on the Olympic marathon team for Mexico. And, that was something that I immediately thought about afterward was that, we don't just hear about the top American runners, we often hear about the top Canadian runners, for example. So why aren't we also covering top athletes in Mexico, for example? So I pitched a profile on her to Runner's World saying like, this is someone who we haven't heard of and we should learn more about her. And that ended up being a really fun story to work on. She had a really great story about, how she wanted to pursue a professional career as a runner. And most people in her circle, like her friends and family, told her, like, you're probably not going to be that good. You're probably not going to pursue this professionally. You should probably just get a job in the field that you majored in. And, she kept at it, and look at her now.
Why did she keep at it?
Because she loved it so much, and she thought she had the potential, and she wanted to keep pursuing it.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I just love asking why. Like finding motivation and finding like the reason that somebody does something is just really personally fascinating. Like, why did you get up today? Why did you go for your run? Why are you, sometimes I'll ask, why are you here? Like these types of questions about, small talk.
Yeah.
Switching gears again, what does success mean to you?
I guess success professionally to me, I guess it means, to be super specific for my career, it means seeing those stories that I'm really passionate about and want to see come to fruition, actually making them happen. I guess what I would consider one of the more important stories that I've worked on recently is a story that I worked on for Runner's World a little over a year ago, kind of at the height of the social justice reckoning that we're still experiencing in this country, in light of the murder of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd. I pitched a story to Runner's World saying we can talk to, I guess, about 10 runners about their experiences with racism as it relates to running and their perceptions of diversity and inclusion as it relates to running. And when I first pitched that story to Runner's World, they said that they had someone on staff who was working on something similar. So I guess I was sort of turning it down in the moment. And a few weeks went by and I didn't see anything published. So I circled back with them about it to see if they were actually doing anything with it. And they told me that the staffer that they had put on it didn't really have much luck and wasn't really finding enough people to do it. And they decided to let me take a stab at it. And to me, that sounded, that was crazy to me that they couldn't find enough people, because when I worked on it, it wasn't hard at all to find enough people to talk to. And I think, me being a person of color, that gives me, it puts me in a unique position to be able to relate to people, to make them potentially more comfortable when it comes to opening up about these stories. And I think that's an important thing for writers to consider when they might be pitching stories on potentially sensitive topics, to maybe ask themselves, like, why am I the right person to cover this topic and write this story? And so I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think if you're able to successfully answer that question as to why I'm the right person to work on this project or assignment, I think if you can answer that, I think that's a good marker of success.
Yeah, and I think persistence is also important in any job, but particularly in something where pitching is involved, or sales, or anything like that. Yeah, it's always interesting when I ask this question, and I started asking this and a few other questions. Actually, I want to ask that question. Fast forward 5 to 10 years, what are you really proud of accomplishing?
I guess I would say those important stories like that, that are impactful and share important stories that I think are really important and worthy of being told. I've talked to people in the industry about, some people might think that I've written some of these stories only in the last couple of years because it's kind of been a trending topic. But I've talked to people in the industry about how, if I'd pitched some of these social justice related stories to publications like Runner's World even only like 3 or 4 years ago, they probably wouldn't have been accepted, because the editors would have considered that to be, too political or too controversial. So the fact that, the industry is shifting in a more progressive and positive direction, I think that's a positive move, and that's something that I'm proud to be a part of.
Very cool. And it's really great to see the progress and like the persistence of this needs to be shared. So I'm going to keep asking. And yeah, I love elevating those voices on this podcast that are out there doing good things in the community. I think that I've had a lot of feedback on the guests that I choose, and a lot of it is, it's interesting that you don't go to, whoever has just finished the race the fastest. And I'm like, there's a podcast for that. Like,
Yeah.
Ali on the Run is really, really good at having those conversations. So I'm going to let her have those conversations. And like, that's not my specialty. And it's not like, those aren't the questions I want to ask. I don't want to know the same thing. And again, there's a time and a place for it. I think that there are a lot of people that are interested in those types of stories, but I think that there's so much more to the running community than just running fast. And those are the stories I want to tell.
That's great.
So last question, I think, talk to me about a failure that you've experienced and what you learned from it.
I guess running wise, a failure that I experienced was when, I guess for my second marathon, when I kind of had that seed planted that I wanted to qualify for Boston. After my first marathon, I moved back to Houston a little less than a year later. And so going from New York to Houston and moving to flatland, once I did a lot of races here in Houston, I saw a lot of big gains and dropped a lot of my PRs by a lot. And I ran a 1:45 half that fall before going back to run my second New York City marathon. And I kind of got a little ahead of myself, and still being a little bit of a novice and not having much experience in the marathon, I thought, maybe I'll try to go for it now and see if I'm up for tackling that VQ now. And so when I went for it in New York, after doing zero hill training in New York or in Houston, I bonked hard and really died, and ended up running that second New York City marathon about 10 minutes slower than the previous year. And so that was kind of a rude awakening, and it was kind of a reality check. I came back to Houston, and I wasn't planning, I didn't have any plans to run my next. I knew I'd run a third marathon at some point, but I wasn't sure when. But coming back, I decided to run the Houston Marathon the following January. So about 10 weeks later, just thinking New York was such a colossal failure. And I'm still in pretty good shape. Maybe I should give myself another shot and set a more realistic goal for myself, breaking 4 hours. And so that's exactly what I did that January. And I think that was good for me to kind of have that learning experience and, kind of understand why it's important to set realistic goals for yourself and kind of, take things slow and chip away accordingly when it comes to the marathon.
Very cool. I agree. I also think it's a good lesson in the idea that races are just data points along the way and sort of give you guidance on how to sharpen and what to do differently.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for taking some time to chat today. If people want to follow you and your journey and your writing, where can we find you?
Yeah, my Twitter and Instagram are Emmy Marie B. I'll let you link to those in your show notes rather than spell them out for people. And my website is emiliabenton.com. I have a lot of my work linked on there. I haven't updated it recently, but you can usually find my most recent stories posted on Twitter.
Awesome. And check out her amazing piece in Women's Running on Western States. It was a very good one. Emilia, thanks so much for taking some time to chat, and hope to see you out there again soon.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. That's it for today's episode. Like many long runs, it's sad when it has to end. I hope you join in next time on For the Long Run. And in the meantime, happy trails. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean a lot to me if you shared it so that others can find it and enjoy it too. This podcast and the accompanying music has been produced by Brian Walters of Single Track Sound. For the Long Run's logo was created by Vanessa Wolf of Sterling Wolf.